Hello and welcome to the Absolute Beginner Guitar Lesson Series. My name is Oliver and today's lesson is lesson number 10. And before we get started, I would like to do as I always do. I would like to invite anyone who is watching one of these videos for the very first time to go back and watch the previous lessons. So the subject of today's lessons is triads. So what are triads? Triads are simply 3-note chords, and there are four types of triads, and we're going to look at all four types. So I want to start out the lesson with a statement, and I want you to write this down. I'm going to break the statement down into two parts. And the first part of the statement is that chords are derived or created from major scales, and specifically from the root note parent, as I like to call it in quotes, major scale. So I need you to write that down. That may not make much sense to you right now, but of course that's what we're going to try to get into. However, we need to understand this basic premise that chords are derived from major scales, and specifically from the parent major scale, as I like to call it, of the root note. The first type of triad I would like to look at is a C major triad. So from anyone unfamiliar, anyone who may not have watched lesson 3, there's a method that we can, if we have the notes of our scale and we have a C major scale here, there's a method we can use to derive the notes of our chords. And really quickly, the method involves taking the root note of the chord, which is the note the chord is named for, skipping over the next note of the scale, and then taking the following note of the scale, and then skipping over the next note of the scale and taking the following note. So using this method, we can derive a C major chord, and the notes that we get are C, E, and G. So those are the notes of our major chord, our C major chord. And right now what I'd like to do is I would like to perform an analysis of this chord with respect to the parent major scale of the root note. As we see here, C is the root note, and what I'm calling the parent major scale is the C major scale. So I hope that explains what I've been talking about. So if we analyze this chord, let's look at the first note C. The first note C is actually the first note in the scale. So I'm going to write down the number 1 just to show that the C is the first note in the C major scale. Now let's look at the E note. The E note is the third note in the scale. And finally, we look at the G note. The G note is the 5th note of the scale. So we now have a C major scale, or a C major chord. And as we can observe, the notes of the chord are the first note, the 3rd note, and the 5th note of the C major scale. So now let's look at another major chord. And let's look at the F major chord. And for anyone who doesn't know the notes of the chord, we can derive the chord. We start with the F. So as I stated at the beginning, I said that chords are derived from the root note parent major scale. Well, we have an F major chord here, and in the F major chord, F is the root note. So we need to look at what I call the parent major scale of this root note, which is the F major scale. So now let's analyze this F major chord with respect to the F major scale. So the F note is the first note in the scale. And, you know, just as I'm sure you're going to see, the root note of the chords will always be the first note in the scale. So now let's look at the A note. The A note is the third note in the scale. And finally, the C note is the fifth note in the scale. So our F major chord consists of the first, third, and fifth notes of the F major scale. And you may have recalled that our C major chord consisted of the first, third, and fifth notes of the C major chord. So what this reveals is a formula for deriving a major chord. And the formula is to take the first, third, and fifth notes of the major scale. So now we have derived the formula for a major triad. So moving on. Now let's look at minor chords. Okay, so now let's look at the D minor chord. And if we use our little trick for deriving the notes of the chord, we come up with the note D, the note F, and the note A. So now we have our D minor chord. And in order to perform an analysis on this, we must analyze it with respect to the root note parent major scale. So now the root note of our chord is D. So we need to analyze this with respect to the D major scale. So now let's analyze this chord. As I stated before, the root note always comes from the first note of the scale. So that's 1. So now let's look at the F note. Well, if we look at our scale, there is no note F in the scale. However, the third note of the scale is F sharp. So now, in order for us to have F, we are going to have to alter this note. So we need to take this F sharp note and we need to make it into F. And for those who watched the previous lessons, they know by now that what we need to do is we need to take this F sharp note and flat it, creating the note F. So F sharp is the third note in the scale. And what we've done with the third note of the scale is we flatted the note. So now this F is referred to as the flatted third. And for anyone that's confused, the third note of the scale is F sharp. We flatted that note. That's the reason why we call the F the flatted third. And finally, we have the A note. And as we can see, the A note is the fifth note of the scale. So we can see that the D minor chord consists of the first, the flatted third, and the fifth notes of the D major scale. So hopefully you will believe me when I tell you that this establishes a formula for a minor triad. I don't want to spend a lot of time going through these, so just take my word that this establishes our formula for a minor triad. So the formula for a minor triad is the first note, the flatted third note, and the fifth note of the scale. So now let's compare the major and the minor chords. And instead of us writing out a bunch of different scales to compare various chords, what I'd like to do is I would like to compare these all with using the C major scale. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare chords that have C in the root note. Whoops. So first let's look at the C major chord. So over here I'm just going to write major, and I'm just going to put a line here. So let's start with our formula. We know that the formula for a major chord is the first, the third, and the fifth notes of the root note parent major scale. So now let's derive that C major chord. So first thing we're going to do is take the first note of the scale, C, so now we have our C major chord. And it's important, I think I may have neglected to mention this. It's an important observation to see that for this major triad, all the notes of the chord come directly from the major scale. And I would be willing to bet, because I'm not an expert on music theory, I'd be willing to bet that that's the reason that the chord is named major, because the notes of the chord come directly from the major scale. So now let's look at the minor chord triad. All right, so our formula for a minor triad is the root, the flatted third, and the fifth. So now let's derive our C minor chord. So we start with the root note, that's 1. And then we need the flatted third. Okay, so our flatted third, to get that, we need to take that third note of the scale, E, and we need to flat it. So now we have E flat. And finally, we need the fifth note of the scale, which is C. So let's just compare these two chords. As I stated before, the C chord takes its notes directly from the major scale. So we have the first, the third, and the fifth notes of the major scale. Now, if we look at this minor chord, I can see that in the minor chord, we have the first note of the scale, and we also have the fifth note of the scale. However, we have the flatted third. And I would submit to you right now that the difference between a major triad and a minor triad is in the third. In the major triad, the third comes directly from the scale. The minor triad, the third needs to be altered. It needs to be flatted. So when we look at these two chords in comparison to each other, I hope that it becomes apparent that the only difference between the two chords is in the third. The next type of triad that I want to look at, and I hope everyone has this stuff written out because I am going to need to make changes to the board. So I'm going to erase this stuff out of here. And the next type of triad we're going to look at is the diminished triad. So let's go back to our C major scale, and we can derive the diminished chord by using that trick that I mentioned earlier, and we will come up with the notes B, D, and F. So now let's analyze this B diminished triad. However, we must analyze it with respect to the B major scale. Getting back to what we were talking about, let's look at this B note. The B note is the first note in the scale. Next, we need to look at the D note. And as we can see, the note D is not in the scale. However, we have the note D sharp, which is the third. We need to make that D sharp into a D. So we need to take this D sharp and flat it. And when we flat D sharp, it becomes D. Now we need to reference it. D sharp is the third note of the scale. And to make the D sharp into the D, we had to flat the third note of the scale. So that becomes known as the flatted third. And lastly, let's take a look at the F note in the scale, or in the chord, excuse me. As you can see, the note F isn't in the scale. However, we have F sharp. So we need to alter that note in order to make it F. So we need to take this F sharp and we need to flat it. And now it becomes F. And we have the fifth note of the scale as F sharp. And we needed to flat the note in order to make it F. So the F becomes known as the flatted fifth. So when we look at this triad, one thing that becomes immediately apparent to me is the only note of the triad that's in the root note's major scale is the root note. The third has been altered and the fifth has been altered. So there's been a lot of changes and alterations to the notes of the scale. This establishes our formula for the diminished chord. So I'm just going to write that out over here, diminished. And we have our formula is the root note, the flatted third, and the flatted fifth. Okay, so there is one other type of triad, and we haven't actually encountered that triad because we've been working with major scales, and this triad is not amongst the scale tone chords of the major scales. However, we can still look at it. And because we don't have a chord that we've been working with that we can analyze, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just tell you that the formula for the augmented triad, let me just write that over here, augmented. The formula for the augmented triad is the root, the third, and the sharp fifth. So let's start with the formula. Root, third, sharp fifth. Okay, so what I want to do now is to bring us back into familiar territory. I want to derive a C augmented triad. So we need the first note of the scale, and that gives us C. And we need the third note of the scale, which gives us E. And now we need the sharp fifth note of the scale. So what we need to do is we need to find the fifth note of the scale, which is G, and we need to sharp that note. And when we sharp the G note, it becomes G sharp. So now let me take a closer look at this triad. What I can see when I look at this triad is that this triad, the augmented triad, contains the first note of the parent root note parent major scale and the third note of the root note parent major scale. And the only note that has been changed or altered from the scale is the fifth, and we have the sharp 5. So now that we've looked at the various triads, I'd like to do sort of a comparison And I'm going to erase some of this stuff here. So I want to do a recap, basically, of the information. And so I want to cover a few points. And the first point is that chords are derived from major scales. And specifically, they're derived from what I call the parent major scale of the root note. In other words, a C major chord comes from a C major scale. And also that when we analyze these triads, formulas become apparent. So we see that we have these formulas, which we sort of established and sort of proved out to ourselves. And that major and augmented chords are sort of major in nature because they both share the third note of the major scale, which is what really makes the major triad major. And minor and diminished chords are minor in nature because they both share the flatted third note of the scale, which essentially is what creates the minor triad. And I also want to let you know that there are times when substitutions can be made. For example, the augmented chord triad could be substituted for the major triad, and the diminished triad could be substituted for the minor triad. So that's about it. That's it for the lesson. So put in your time, put in your work, and I hope to see you there. Peace.